Raymond Ibrahim translates key al-Qaeda documents, some previously unavailable in English, that provide a window into the thinking of radical Islam's leadership. The Al-Qaeda Reader, divided into theology and propaganda, focuses on the writings of Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden. Raymond Ibrahim is interviewed by Lawrence Wright, winner of the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction, for his book The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11.
Raymond, congratulations on the publication of your new book, Al-Qaeda Reader by Doubleday, just now out. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
Sure. Well, it kind of all starts actually with 9/11, ironically. When 9/11 occurred, I was living in California and I was attending Fresno State University. And I had just started my master's thesis, which ironically dealt with what's called the Battle of Yarmouk, which was one of the very first battles between the growing Islamic power, about 4 years after Muhammad died, and Christendom, the Byzantines. And so when the 9/11 attacks happened, even though I was mostly immersed in historical and theological studies regarding Islam and Christianity, and I hadn't been paying too much attention to contemporary affairs, I really didn't know, like most people, who al-Qaeda was prior to that. But I started reading some of their communiques on the internet and some of their statements, and I became very amazed to find the sort of continuity that existed between al-Qaeda and what I was studying, which was the Battle of Yarmouk, which was 1,400 years before 9/11. For example, even though no one in the West will really know about that battle, you'll find al-Qaeda in the book, for example. He often quotes it as an example, you know, as some sort of role model for the Mujahideen. So anyway, at that point, I really got fascinated with the whole radical Islam movement, and I decided to further my education by focusing specifically in that. I was focusing mostly on the early historical aspects, like the Crusades also. So I applied to Georgetown University, the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies, and I went there, and that's what brought me out to DC. And then after one semester, I got an internship at the Library of Congress at the Near East section, which is also very conducive to what I was trying to research. And I went there, and eventually I had to drop out of Georgetown due to the full-time job. And so while I was there, I still had an interest in al-Qaeda, and I would still always look on the internet and read about their statements and their communiques and their interviews. And I had a pretty good picture of what their grievances were, which I think a lot of us do. And their grievances range from things like, the main one, of course, is Western support for Israel. The deaths of children due to UN sanctions in Iraq, everything, and then of course later, and at the time, of course, one of the big ones was that the US forces were based in Saudi Arabia, and the list went on, and then when the US invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, that also became a grievance, and Iraq is a grievance. So then, in the course of my duties at work, where at the Near East section, where we get so many books from the Arab world, all written in Arabic, it's my habit to just peruse through books, especially when they'd have a picture of Osama bin Laden or a picture of the Statue of Liberty with a sword and blood coming out of its mouth. And I would look at these, and I started coming across various excerpts, and then I found essays and entire treatises written by Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, which subsequently I found had never been translated or disseminated. And I started reading these, and what struck me immediately was how different in both tone and content these were. Now there was no talk about grievances and, you know, reciprocal treatment. We're attacking you because you attacked us. And these were theological treatises. They don't have to do with the temporal. They have to do with what God wants Muslims to do. And so when I started reading these, I found it started rendering moot all their grievances. And the reason I say that is because, for example, their propaganda culminates with them, like I said, saying all we're doing, including 9/11, is retaliation to the U.S.'s aggression. To our provocations. Exactly. Yes. So for example, here's a quote from Osama bin Laden. He says, when he was addressing the Americans a couple of years ago, he said, "In conclusion, I say to the American people, we will continue to fight you and continue to conduct martyrdom operations, suicide bombings, inside and outside America until you depart from your oppressive course, abandon your follies and rein in your fools." So you can see he says, until you do these things, which, if they're true, then it's plausible. One can understand his grievance.
You often hear him saying that, you know, we are making offers, you know,
exactly.
Recently
he's reaching out.
In his most recent videotape, for instance, and in 2004 when he offered a truce to the Europeans, it's on you.
He portrays himself basically, like you're saying, the ball's in your court.
Right.
Once you cease the hostilities, we will too. And then a very common statement that he always makes in his messages goes as follows: reciprocal treatment is part of justice. He who initiates the aggression is the unjust one. And he's of course implying that it's the U.S. and West. And then these texts that I came across, and eventually I included 4 treatises that make up the theology section, which is well more than half of the book. The first one, which was written by Osama bin Laden, is called Moderate Islam is a Prostration to the West. That one just completely, totally renders moot all of his grievances. And the reason is because it was addressed specifically to Muslims, to the Muslims in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis.
Right.
And it was never meant for Western eyes, and that's why we haven't seen it, even though it was written right around 2002.
Really? And what it was a written communique or a tape or something?
Well, it has an interesting history, actually. Basically, some time ago, he says about, in the book, he says approximately 60 American crusaders and priests and intellectuals, those are his words, drafted a letter, a very stern letter, in his words, saying why, and it's titled What We Are Fighting For.
I remember that,
yeah.
Yes indeed.
I don't know if it's from the American Foundation of, it's in the end notes, I can pull it up later. But so they wrote this letter and they directed it to the Muslim world. And then about 100 Saudi clerics, very authoritative clerics, wrote back a letter called How We Can Coexist. And this letter, if you read it, it's basically, it captures the moderate Islamic voice.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like you're talking to a moderate Muslim. And they talk about things like, we want to live with equality, we want to treat each other justly, we want to live, you know, live and let live. And then Osama bin Laden got irate and wrote a letter to those Muslims called Moderate Islam is a Prostration to the West. And he completely tears into them. And what makes it important, though, is that his attack is very much theologically grounded.
Right.
He gives the sources that render their arguments false. For example, when those moderates had written in their statement to the Americans, they talked about how we want to live, like I said, in peace and we want to get along. And then he wrote to them and he says, this is him talking, Osama, what evidence is there for Muslims to pursue this dialogue and shared understanding? Because they were also saying dialogue and shared understandings are very important between us, Muslims and non-Muslims. What did the Prophet, the companions after him, and the righteous forebears do? Did they wage jihad against the infidels, attacking them all over the earth in order to place them under the suzerainty of Islam in great humility and submission? Or did they send messages to discover shared understandings, he's being sarcastic, between themselves and the infidels in order that they may reach an understanding whereby universal peace, security, and natural relations would spread in such a satanic manner as this? Now what's ironic is he puts down universal peace, security, and natural relations that the moderates and that the Americans would be talking about, that sort of thing. But when he himself communicates with the West, he always talks about the Western standard of peace and security and natural relations. So you can see there's a contradiction, a little hypocrisy going on here.
Well, Raymond, in your examination of all these documents, have you noticed an evolution in al-Qaeda's thinking? It seems to me that when al-Qaeda really began to be formed, and going up during the whole period of the American buildup in Saudi Arabia to counter Saddam Hussein and so on, he had stated political goals. Expel the infidels from the Arabian Peninsula. And he more or less accomplished those goals in March of 2003 when the Bush administration announced that they were going to withdraw their forces from Saudi Arabia because Saddam Hussein was overthrown and the no-fly zone no longer had to be enforced. The very next month, al-Qaeda began its assault on Western housing compounds. And you saw a similar situation in Madrid where, you know, the al-Qaeda cell there had succeeded